The day Joel Bristol rode into Harlan Creek, the sky above the Texas panhandle was the color of a bruise, purple and swollen at the edges, as if the land itself were warning him that nothing about what he was about to do would be easy. He had been riding for 4 days straight from Abilene, stopping only when his horse, a sturdy roan mare named Cora, insisted on rest. He had a letter folded in his breast pocket, pressed so close to his chest that the paper had softened from the heat of his body. He had read it so many times that he no longer needed to unfold it to remember every word. Thomas Conley had written it from his deathbed in the spring of 1876, and Joel had received it 2 weeks after Thomas was already in the ground. The letter was simple, the way Thomas had always been simple, direct and honest, and carrying no extra weight. It said, "Joel, you are the best man I have ever known and the best friend any soul could hope to have. My Violet is alone now on the homestead outside Harlan Creek. I have tried to make arrangements, but the land is stubborn, and the town is not always kind to a woman without a husband. I am not asking you to marry her. I am not asking you to give up your life. I am only asking you to ride out there when you can and make sure she is all right. Make sure she knows she is not forgotten. That is all I ask of a good man." Joel had not gone, not right away. He had told himself there were reasons, and some of them had even been true. He had been working a cattle drive through New Mexico territory in the spring of 1876, and by the time the letter reached him it was summer, and by summer he had taken on another job because a man had to eat. He had told himself Violet Conley was a capable woman, which was true. He had told himself she likely had family nearby, which turned out not to be true at all. He had told himself he would go in the autumn, and then winter came, and then another year, and then another. 6 years passed the way bad dreams sometimes do, quickly and yet with every detail intact, so that when you finally wake from them, you feel every lost hour pressing down on you at once. It was the autumn of 1882 when Joel Bristol finally pointed Cora toward Harlan Creek, and the guilt that rode with him was heavier than anything he had ever carried on a cattle drive. The town of Harlan Creek was small and weathered, the kind of place that had been hopeful once and had since settled into a kind of pragmatic endurance. There was a single main street with a general store, a livery stable, a post office that also served as the telegraph office, a saloon that smelled of sawdust and old beer, and a church at the far end whose white paint had gone gray from years of dust and wind. A few people moved along the boardwalks in the late afternoon light, and Joel noted their faces the way a man does when he is riding into unfamiliar territory, not with suspicion exactly, but with the steady attention of someone who has learned that people tell you a great deal about a place before they open their mouths. He stopped at the general store and tied Cora to the hitching post. Inside, a heavy-set man with a florid complexion and a white apron was stacking tins of molasses on a shelf behind the counter. He looked up when the door opened. "Afternoon," Joel said. "Afternoon, you passing through?" "Maybe. Looking for a place called the Conley Homestead. Can you point me toward it?" The storekeeper's expression shifted in a way Joel had learned to read over years of dealing with people in small towns, a slight tightening around the eyes, a brief assessment being conducted behind the pleasantness. "You know the Conleys?" "Knew Thomas. We worked cattle together for about 5 years before he settled down. I was sorry to hear he passed. Were you now?" The storekeeper seemed to soften slightly. "Violet's about 3 miles east of town. You follow the creek road east until you see a big stand of cottonwoods, the homestead's behind them. Can't miss the barn, it's red, or it was red. Might be faded to pink by now." He paused. "She's a hard worker, that woman. Harder than most men I know. She's kept that place going all by herself, and she doesn't complain, which I'll say is more than most people would manage. She doing all right?" "She's surviving," the storekeeper said, and the way he said it made it clear that surviving and all right were two different things entirely. Joel bought a paper sack of cornmeal, a tin of peaches, and a pound of salt pork, because it seemed wrong to arrive empty-handed, and then he rode east along the creek road in the fading light. He smelled the cottonwoods before he saw them, that dusty, sweet smell that cottonwoods carry in autumn when their leaves have gone yellow and begin to let go. He followed the bend in the creek road, and then the homestead came into view, and he pulled Cora to a stop and just looked at it for a moment. It was a decent-sized property for the Texas Panhandle, a main house built of sod and timber, a barn that was indeed faded from red to something close to rust, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden that had been recently put to bed for the season with the dry stalks bundled and stacked. There was a windmill turning slowly in the evening breeze, and a water trough beside the barn, and a rope clothesline strung between two posts with nothing on it now as the light was going. And there was a woman in the yard. She was carrying 2 full buckets from the pump, one in each hand, walking steadily toward the barn with the easy efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times. She was wearing a dark dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, her dark hair pinned up but escaping in pieces around her face. She was not small. She had the kind of strong, straight posture that comes from years of physical work, and she moved with a focused purposefulness that made it clear she had 1,000 things left to do before the sun went down, and she was going to do every single one of them. She heard Cora's hoofbeats and set the buckets down in one smooth motion and turned to face him with her hands loose at her sides. She was not afraid, he noticed. She was watchful, but she was not afraid. He rode to the edge of the yard and stopped. "Mrs. Conley?" "That's right." Her voice was even and clear. She had light brown eyes, he could see them even from the distance, and her face was stronger than it was pretty in the conventional sense, though the combination of strength and the lingering warmth in those eyes made it something better than pretty. She looked at him with direct, measured attention. "I don't know you." "No, ma'am. My name is Joel Bristol. I worked cattle with your husband from about 1868 to 1874 before he settled here. He wrote to me when he was sick. I should have come sooner." He paused. "I am very sorry that I didn't." Something moved across her face, he couldn't have named it exactly, and then her chin came up slightly. "Mr. Bristol, I remember Thomas mentioning you. I brought a few things from town." He indicated the saddlebag. "Cornmeal, salt pork, peaches. I didn't know what you needed." She studied him for a long moment. The chickens moved around the yard with their busy, self-important rustling. The windmill turned. Somewhere across the creek a coyote started its early evening song and then thought better of it. "You can put your horse in the barn," Violet Conley said at last. "There's a spare stall. I'll start supper." He could not have told you afterward what he had expected, but it wasn't this. The immediate, practical extension of hospitality as those strange men arrived at her property every evening. Later he would understand that it wasn't trust exactly, or not only trust. It was something closer to competence. Violet Conley knew she could handle herself, and so she did not spend energy on being afraid of things that had not yet proved themselves worthy of fear. He unsaddled Cora and rubbed her down and gave her water and oats, taking his time because he always took time with horses. And when he came into the house, Violet had salt pork in a skillet and cornbread in the Dutch oven, and she was boiling coffee on the stove with the focused efficiency he was coming to think of as simply her way of existing in the world. The house inside was clean and spare. A stone fireplace on one wall with a fire beginning to take hold, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a bookshelf with maybe a dozen books, their spines worn from reading, a quilt on the rocking chair by the fire, brightly colored, elaborate in its pattern that was clearly not purely functional and spoke of something deeper, some inner life she kept between the work. "Sit," she said, and he sat. She brought coffee first, in a heavy ceramic mug, and then plates, and they ate across the table from each other in a quiet that was not uncomfortable, which surprised him. He had expected awkwardness or grief or possibly anger, because he deserved her anger and had been bracing for it since Abilene. But she ate with the quiet concentration of a woman who had learned not to waste anything, including the energy required to be angry at a man for something that couldn't be changed now. "How long has it been?" she asked at one point. "Since Thomas wrote, 6 years this past spring." She nodded. She did not say anything to that. "I am sorry," he said again, because he did not know what else to offer, and it was true. "He thought very well of you," she said. "He said you were the kind of man who did what needed doing and didn't make a drama of it." She looked at him steadily across the table. He was usually right about people. He was a good man. "Yes," she said simply, "he was." They were quiet again. Outside, the wind was picking up, rolling across the flats and pressing against the house with a sound like a low-held breath. "How have you been managing?" he asked. "The storekeeper said you've been keeping the place running." "Mr. Aldrich tends toward understatement," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was related to one. "I have been managing fine. The first year was the hardest. The second year I learned what I did not know the first year. By the third year I had a system." She took a sip of coffee. "The land is good land. Thomas chose well. I just had to learn to work it." "Do you have any help? Neighbors who come by?" "Margaret Foss, about a mile north. She'll come and lend a hand during canning season, and I do the same for her. The Aldrich boy came out for a week in the spring to help me with the roof when a section came loose in the winter storms. I paid him in chickens." She paused. "I do all right." He looked at her hands around the coffee mug, broad, capable hands, work roughened, with a faint scar along the left thumb from something she would tell him about later. He thought about Thomas Conley, who had been a quiet, methodical man with a talent for friendship and a deep, straightforward loyalty to the people he loved, and he thought that Thomas had known his wife well enough to know that she would survive. That wasn't why Thomas had written the letter. Thomas had written the letter because surviving was not the same thing as all right, and the difference mattered to a man who had loved someone well. "I'll stay a few days if you'll have me," Joel said. "See if there's anything that needs doing. After that, I won't trouble you." Violet looked at him across the table with those light brown eyes that had a way of seeing more than you offered them. "The south fence needs mending," she said, "and the loft in the barn needs new boards in 3 places before the winter, and the smokehouse chimney is drafting poorly. If you stay a few days and help with those things, I would be grateful." "Then I'll stay," he said. He slept in the barn, on a cot she produced from somewhere with a wool blanket that smelled of cedar, and he lay in the dark listening to Cora breathe and the horses stir and the wind work its way across the Texas sky. And he thought about Thomas Conley, and about the way Violet had said he was usually right about people. And he thought that Thomas had perhaps known something about this situation that Joel himself had not yet caught up to. He rose before dawn the way he always did, and went to the pump in the yard to wash his face in the cold water, and he found Violet already there, filling a bucket, already dressed, her dark hair pinned back, a purpose in every motion. She glanced at him. "Coffee's on. You're up early." "I'm always up early. The animals don't sleep late." He nodded. "Neither do I." They drank coffee in the half-dark of the kitchen while the eastern sky went slowly from black to deep purple, and he was struck again by the ease of the quiet between them, which seemed like something that should have required more time to develop. Over the following days he worked. He mended the south fence, 200 yards of it, resetting posts and restringing wire in the hard November ground, his breath making clouds in the cold morning air. He replaced the bad boards in the barn loft, crawling across the existing boards to find the rotten ones, and prying them up and fitting the new lumber he drove into Harlan Creek to buy. He fixed the smokehouse chimney, pulling the blockage, a bird's nest the size of a man's hat, abandoned but thoroughly packed from the flue, and remortaring the loose stones around the base. He was useful. He had always been useful, and he found that usefulness in this particular place, in service of this particular woman's carefully constructed independence, felt different from any usefulness he had experienced before. He was not rescuing her. He was not riding in on a white horse to save a helpless widow. She was very plainly not helpless and would have been annoyed at the suggestion. He was simply doing what needed doing, the way Thomas had described in the letter, and the simplicity of that felt clean and good. In the evenings they ate supper together and talked, and this was where the days began to take on their particular quality. Violet Conley talked the way she did everything else, with precision and without waste, but also with a quiet depth that surprised him. She had come from Missouri with Thomas in 1872, had been married to him 4 years before he died, and in those years and in the 6 years since she had read every book she could get her hands on, had learned to do things that women in her mother's generation would not have imagined doing, and had developed strong opinions about everything from the best method of putting up tomatoes to the question of whether the federal government's treatment of the Comanche people in the recent decade had been anything other than a series of deliberately broken promises dressed up as policy. This last opinion was delivered one evening after Joel had told her that some of the new settlers coming into the panhandle were having trouble adjusting to what they called the wilderness of the place, and Violet had set her coffee mug down and said, "It is only wilderness to the people who are not from here. To the Comanche, it is home, or was home, until we decided our need for it mattered more than their right to it. I don't think that is something we should be proud of." Joel had been a man who had lived his life largely moving through the West without spending much time questioning the structure of things. He was not unkind and he was not cruel, but he had never had much occasion to sit across from a woman who spoke with that kind of calm moral clarity, and he found it startling and then admirable, and then, without his quite noticing when it happened, something he actively looked forward to hearing. By the end of the first week, the fence was done and the loft was repaired and the smokehouse chimney drew properly, and he had invented a fourth project, rehanging the barn door that had dropped on its hinge and dragged in the dirt, and then a fifth project, cutting and splitting a winter's worth of firewood that Violet acknowledged she had been dreading because the woodpile was low. "You don't have to stay," she told him on the 8th day, not unkindly but with the directness that was her nature. "You've done what you came to do." He was stacking split logs against the side of the house. He straightened and looked at her. She was standing in the yard with her arms crossed against the cold, not defensively, but because the November wind off the plains was sharp, and she was watching him with that steady, measuring look that he had started to feel like something physical when it was directed at him. "I know I don't have to," he said. "Then why?" He considered this honestly, because she deserved honesty, and because he was beginning to want to give her everything she deserved, which was a thought he had not examined closely yet, but that was sitting just beneath his conscious attention with a patient insistence. "Because I'm not ready to leave," he said finally. She looked at him for a long moment and something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, because Violet Conley did not soften in the way that word usually implied, but opening like a door that had been closed, not locked, moved by the right kind of hand. "All right," she said. "There's a lot of winter ahead, and the barn door still drags," he smiled. "I know. I've been working up to it." She almost smiled back. He counted it as a victory of the first order. December came, and with it the kind of cold that the Texas panhandle does with a particular ferocity, the wind that drops the temperature faster than your body can account for and turns the flat land into something enormous and indifferent. Joel brought Cora into the barn with Violet's 2 horses, a bay gelding named Sam and a spotted mare she called Dot, and stacked hay around the stall walls to cut the drafts, and Violet brought extra blankets for the cot without his asking, and said nothing about it beyond setting them down and going back inside, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. They settled into a daily rhythm that had the comfortable, unremarked quality of something that had always been. He rose early and went to the pump, and she was usually already there, and they drank coffee together in the growing dark of the short winter mornings before the day's work separated them. He managed the heavier outdoor tasks, hauling water, feeding the horses, any work that required brute physical strength, and she managed the house and the chickens and the kitchen garden, and the thousand intricate operations of keeping a homestead functional in winter. In the late afternoons, when the light faded fast and the cold drove them indoors, they sat by the fire and she read while he mended leather or cleaned equipment, and sometimes she read aloud, which she did naturally and without self-consciousness, in a voice that was clear and measured and lovely. He realized sometime in the second week of December, deeply happy. He had not been deeply happy in a long time, and the recognition of it was startling enough that he sat one evening in the firelight while Violet read from a novel she had borrowed from Margaret Foss, and he looked at her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the particular way she held her head when she was absorbed in a text, the small movements of expression that crossed her face as she read. And he thought with a clarity that was almost alarming, I do not want to leave this place. I do not want to leave this woman. He was 34 years old. He had spent most of his adult life on cattle drives and in the rough company of men who moved across the landscape without attaching to any piece of it, and he had understood that life and had been good at it. But he had also always known, in the quiet way you know things that live below the level of daily thought, that it was not the life he had wanted from the beginning. He had wanted exactly this, the warm room, the fire, the woman reading aloud, and it had taken Thomas Conley's death and his own 6 years of delay, and finally the act of coming here to show him that he had been wanting it all along. He said nothing. He was not a man who spoke before he was certain, and he was not yet certain of the right thing to say. What he was certain of was that he would not leave before the time was right. In mid-December, a matter arose that showed him another side of Violet's situation in Harlan Creek. He had ridden into town for supplies and stopped at the general store, where Aldrich was behind the counter as usual, and 3 men were at the far end of the store engaged in a conversation that paused when Joel came in. One of the men was heavy-set and prosperous-looking, wearing a coat that had cost more than most people in Harlan Creek spent on clothes in a year. His name, Joel learned later, was Carson Meade, and he owned the largest cattle operation in the county with about 12,000 acres running east to the county line. Meade looked at Joel with a frank, appraising interest that felt more like assessment than curiosity. "You'd be the man staying out at the Conley place," he said. It was not a question. "I would," Joel said. "Meade," the man said, extending his hand. "Carson Meade. I've been meaning to have a conversation with Violet Conley about her eastern pasture. She's sitting on about 300 acres that would connect my north range to my southeast range very usefully. I've offered her a fair price." "Have you?" Joel said. "4 times," Aldrich put in from behind the counter, with the mild tone of a man who has been watching something develop for a while and has thoughts about it. "She's a stubborn woman," Meade said, but the way he said it made it clear he thought stubbornness in a widow was something to be managed rather than respected. "She can't work all of it properly herself, and it's good land. It would be well used on my operation." "It sounds like she's decided," Joel said pleasantly. Meade looked at him with a slightly narrowed attention. "Are you related to the family?" "No." "Then I'm not sure it's a matter that concerns you, Mr. Bristol." "It concerns me because I'm staying there," Joel said, with the same pleasantness, which had a quality that experienced men recognized as meaning the pleasantness was real but had a firm floor under it. "And because what you're describing is a woman who has told you no 4 times and you're still talking about it. That seems like something worth noticing." Meade held his gaze for a moment, then produced a deliberate smile and turned back to his companions. Joel bought his supplies and rode back to the homestead. That evening he told Violet what had happened. She listened without surprise and with the set expression of someone who has been managing an irritation for a long time. "He started asking me about the eastern pasture about a year after Thomas died," she said. "Every time I say no, he comes back with a slightly different framing of the same offer. The last time he implied that a woman alone might find it difficult to maintain clear title to land in the county if certain legal questions were raised. She said this with a level calm that was more alarming than anger would have been. I went to the land office in Amarillo myself and confirmed that my title is clear and properly recorded. He has no legal ground to stand on. He implied he might manufacture some. Yes, he did. She set her mug down. I have not been frightened by it, if that's what you're thinking, but it is something I am aware of. Joel looked at her across the table in the firelight. She was looking back at him with that steady directness that he had come to understand was not hardness, but was instead the expression of someone who had decided not to flinch from things. "I'll be here," he said, "through the winter at least. If he comes around while I'm here, he'll know the land isn't unprotected." Something moved in her eyes, something complex and warm and briefly visible before she brought it under the usual composure. "I don't need protection," she said. "I know you don't. But you shouldn't have to fight the same fight alone that would be easier fought with two." She looked at him for a long time. "That," she said quietly, "is a fair thing to say." He stayed. The week before Christmas, Margaret Foss came for a visit. She was a compact, cheerful woman of about 45 with intelligent eyes and the direct manner that seemed common to women who had survived significant stretches of hard country. And she brought a dried apple pie and set it on the table and looked at Joel with a frank assessment that reminded him of the way a farmer looks at a horse he is considering. "So you're the man Thomas wrote to," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You took your time getting here." "I did," he said. "I'm not proud of it." She considered this and apparently decided that honesty counted for something. "Well, you're here now." She turned to Violet. "The apple pie is for Christmas. You can have it early if you want." They had the pie early that evening, all three of them at the kitchen table with coffee and the fire going and the wind pressing at the windows with its cold outside petition. And Margaret told stories about her own homesteading years, some of them funny and some of them not. And Violet laughed at the funny ones with a laugh that was full and genuine and briefly unguarded. And Joel sat across the table and watched her laugh, and felt something in his chest that he had no experience with. And that frightened him slightly because of how complete it was. After Margaret left, pulling her coat around her and declaring that she could find her way home in the dark with her eyes shut after 20 years, Joel and Violet sat by the fire in the quiet that was their usual evening, and Violet said without looking up from her book, "She likes you." That's generous of her. Margaret is not generous by default. She decides things. She turned a page. She decided about Thomas in about 5 minutes. She was right. He said nothing, because there was a quality to the conversation that felt like it might be going somewhere, and he did not want to interrupt its natural movement. "He said to me this afternoon while you were splitting wood," Violet continued, still with her eyes on the page, "that you look at me the way a man looks at something he is trying to figure out whether he is allowed to want." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved across the land with its low, indifferent voice. "She's a perceptive woman," Joel said. Violet closed the book then, keeping her finger between the pages, and looked at him. The firelight moved across her face and made her eyes very warm. "Are you?" she asked, trying to figure that out. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "I am." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she opened her book again. But the line of her mouth had changed, and what he read in it was not rejection. On Christmas Day they ate a proper dinner. Violet had been saving a smoked ham, and she roasted it with dried apple and a little honey, and there were biscuits and pickled beans from the root cellar, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the fire going and ate slowly and talked about things they had not talked about before. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, her father who had been a farmer and her mother who had been a reader of books and had made sure her daughter was too. She told him about meeting Thomas when she was 22, at a church social where Thomas had been the quietest man in the room and had somehow ended up beside her on the porch, and had talked for an hour about what he wanted to build in the West, and how she had listened and thought that this was a man who had the kind of honest ambition she could respect. She told him about the journey to Texas in 1872, the difficulty of the first months, the way Thomas had learned and adapted, and how she had learned and adapted alongside him, and how they had built something here in the 6 years before he got sick, something real and hers. Joel told her about his own life with a candor he did not often offer about growing up in Ohio, the second son of a farmer who had not had enough land to divide between two sons, about heading west at 18 with nothing much to recommend him except a strong back and a willingness to work, about years of cattle drives through Kansas and New Mexico and Colorado, about the particular freedom of that life, and also its loneliness, which he had accepted as the price of the freedom until recently, when he had begun to think the bargain was not as good as he had believed. "What changed?" she asked. "Coming here," he said. She looked at him across the table with the directness she always used and said nothing, but she reached across and poured more coffee into his mug, and the gesture was so small and yet so completely natural that it hit him somewhere deep and steady. In January, Carson Meade came to the homestead. He rode out on a Thursday morning with one of his men, a quiet, watchful fellow who stayed on his horse while Meade dismounted, and he stood in the yard and called out for Mrs. Conley with the voice of a man who is accustomed to people coming to him when he calls. Joel was repairing a section of the corral fence and straightened up when he heard the call. Violet came out of the house and stood in the yard with her arms at her sides. "Mr. Meade," she said, "I wasn't expecting you." "I've come with a revised offer," Meade said. "More generous than the last. I'd like you to consider it seriously." He glanced at Joel with a brief dismissive appraisal. "Privately, if possible." "Mr. Bristol is welcome to stay," Violet said. Meade produced a folded paper and extended it. "I'm offering $800 for the eastern pasture and mineral rights. That's $200 more than my last offer, and it's a fair price." Violet did not take the paper. "My answer is the same as it has been every time you've asked, Mr. Meade. The land is not for sale. You can't work it alone. I am working it. You have a man helping you now," Meade said, with a slight emphasis that suggested he was implying something he chose not to state directly. "But that's a temporary arrangement. When he moves on, you'll be back to where you were before. A woman alone on this much land is a liability." Joel walked over from the corral at that point, unhurried, and stood beside Violet, not in front of her, beside her. "The lady has given you her answer," he said. "She's given it to you 5 times now, by my count. A decent man hears no the first time." Meade looked at him with the flat, controlled anger of a man who is not used to being checked. "I don't know what your situation is here, Bristol, but you have no legal standing on this property and no right to speak on her behalf." "I'm not speaking on her behalf," Joel said. "She spoke for herself very clearly. I'm simply agreeing with her, which is a different thing." There was a long moment in which the cold January air seemed to hold itself still. Then Meade folded the paper and put it back in his coat and said, with a deliberate pleasantness that was not pleasant at all, "My offer stands until spring." He mounted his horse and rode away with his man beside him, and the sound of the horses faded into the flat winter landscape. Violet stood in the yard and watched them go. Then she turned to Joel and looked at him with an expression that was complex and warm and more unguarded than he had seen it. "Thank you," she said, "for standing with me." "I meant what I said before," he told her. "The fight is easier with two." She held his gaze. Then she nodded once and went back inside, and he went back to the corral fence, and neither of them said anything more about it that day. But something had shifted between them, small and certain, the way a door moves in a wind and does not close again. February was the hardest month, as February in the Texas Panhandle always is. A storm came through in the first week that dropped the temperature to something that burned, and the snow that fell was not the pleasant Christmas kind, but the driving, bitter kind that found every gap in the sod walls and turned the barn into a cold cave where the horses huddled together for warmth. Joel slept in the house during the storm, on a pallet by the fire, and they kept the fire going in shifts through the 3 days of the worst of it, each of them taking 4 hours while the other slept. On the second night, at about 3 in the morning, Joel woke to find Violet sitting by the fire on her watch with her knees drawn up and a book open in her lap, the quilt from the rocking chair around her shoulders, and her face turned slightly away from him toward the fire. In the firelight she looked like something rare, not idealized, not simplified, but real and entirely herself and beautiful in the particular way of things that have endured. He lay in the dark and watched her for a moment with his heart doing something large and quiet in his chest, and then he said softly so as not to startle her, "Violet." She turned to look at him. "You should be sleeping." "I woke up," he said. "You don't have to sit the whole watch alone." "I am perfectly capable of sitting alone, Joel." It was the first time she had used his first name. He noticed it, and by the slight shift in her expression, so did she. "I know you are," he said, "but I'd like the company." She looked at him for a moment, then moved slightly to one side of the hearth rug in a way that made space. He got up and brought his blanket and sat beside her, close but not touching, and she went back to her book and read in silence for a while with the fire between them and the storm outside, and the strange, full quiet of two people who are very comfortable in the same space. After a while she said, without looking up from her book, "He talked about you often, you know, Thomas. He said Joel Bristol is the most dependable man I have ever met except in his own interest, and someday that will catch up with him." Joel was quiet for a moment. He was right. He usually was. She turned a page. "He also said that you were the loneliest man he knew and that you didn't seem to know it. Was he right about that too?" She looked up from her book and met his eyes, and the firelight made everything very warm and close. "I think so," she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "And you," he said. "Are you lonely?" She considered it honestly, the way she considered everything. "I have been," she said. "I built a life here that is full of work and purpose, and I would not trade what I built. But there is a difference between purpose and company. I understood that better after you came." The fire settled and sent a small cascade of sparks up the chimney. The storm pressed at the walls with its cold, impersonal voice. "Violet," he said. "Joel." She said his name again, and it had a quality in her voice that was different from how she said other words, something less guarded, something that lived below the composure she had built so carefully over 6 years alone. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on her knee, carefully, with a question in the gesture, and she turned her hand under his and held it back. And that was all that happened that night, but it was everything, and they sat by the fire in the storm until the dawn came, and the storm quieted, and the world outside went white and clean and still, and they were still holding hands when the light came. After the storm, something had changed between them that did not change back. He did not move out of the house after the pallet by the fire. He brought his few belongings in from the barn, a saddlebag and a bedroll and a spare shirt, and set them by the door, and Violet did not remark on it, but she made space for his things on the shelf beside the door with the same naturalness with which she had set aside space on the hearth rug, as though making room was simply something you did for someone who belonged. They were not rushed. They were both people who had learned patience, she from 6 years of building a life alone and he from 34 years of living one worth examining, and the courtship that developed between them had the quality of something allowed to take its proper time, which made every part of it feel deliberate and real. He began to find small ways to do things he did not announce as what they were. He started bringing wildflowers when they appeared in March, the first tentative ones along the creek bank, and setting them in the tin cup on the kitchen table without comment, as though flowers in March were simply part of the household routine. She began leaving coffee already poured when she heard him come in from the morning chores, exactly the way he took it, without his ever having specified. In the evenings, when she read aloud, she would sometimes look up and find him watching her rather than working on whatever he held in his hands, and she would hold his gaze for a beat before going on, and the page she had just read would be the one she read twice without noticing. One evening in late March, when the weather had turned and the light lasted long enough to make the early evenings golden, they walked to the creek after supper, which had become a kind of ritual. The evening walk along the creek bank where the cottonwoods were coming into their new leaves, and the water ran clear and quick with the spring runoff. They walked close together, not quite touching, until Joel's hand found hers in a motion so natural it might have been the wind, and she laced her fingers through his, and they walked that way along the water in the long golden light. He stopped at the big cottonwood that stood at the first bend of the creek, the one with the initials carved low on its trunk TC and VM 1872, carved the year Thomas and Violet had come to this land, when Violet's last name had still been Madden. He looked at the carved letters for a moment. Violet looked at them too. "I think about him," Joel said. "When I think about what I feel for you, I think about him." "So do I," she said. "Does that bother you, that I was his friend?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the initials in the bark. "I asked myself that early on," she said. "When I started to understand what was happening between us, I asked myself if it was wrong. If it would feel like a betrayal." She paused. "And then I thought about what he wrote to you. I never saw the letter, but I know Thomas and I know what he would have written. He would not have sent you here as a messenger. He would have sent you here because he trusted you with the things that mattered to him." She looked up at Joel then, and her eyes were clear and certain. "I do not think it would trouble him. I think it would make him glad." Joel brought her hand up and pressed it briefly against his chest, over the pocket where the letter still lived, worn soft now and folded many times. "I think so too," he said. She stepped a little closer and his arms came around her, and she rested her head against his shoulder in the late March light with the creek running beside them and the cottonwood leaves new and bright overhead. And it was the first time he held her, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like something that had always been true and had simply been waiting for the two of them to find it. He asked her in April. He had been thinking about how to do it for weeks, turning it over in his mind the way he turned over anything he wanted to do correctly. And finally he decided that what Violet would want was not performance or ceremony, but honesty, which was what she had always wanted from everyone, and what he had been giving her since November when he rode in with cornmeal and salt pork, and a debt he was not sure he could repay. They were in the vegetable garden, she showing him what went where for the spring planting, the two of them on their knees in the fresh-turned earth with the smell of soil and new growth all around them. She was explaining the placement of the bean rows with the particular focused enthusiasm she brought to things she had figured out through trial and experience, and he was watching her face rather than the garden, and she said, "Are you even listening to me?" without looking up. "Not entirely," he admitted. "I was thinking about something else." "What were you thinking about?" "I was thinking about whether I was going to say this right." She looked up then, and her expression shifted with the quick intelligence she had for reading what was not yet said. "Violet," he said, "I came here because Thomas asked me to, and I stayed because I couldn't make myself leave. And I'm asking you now, not because I feel I owe anything to Thomas's memory, and not because I think you need me to manage things, because I know you don't, but because I want to spend the rest of my life waking up early and finding you at the pump and drinking coffee in the dark before the day starts. Because I want to sit beside you at the fire while you read and I pretend to work. Because the land here is good land and the life here is good life, and you are the reason both of those things feel like the truest things I have ever known." He stopped. "I am asking if you will marry me. And I understand if you need time to think, because you think about things carefully, and I respect that more than I can say." Violet was looking at him with those light brown eyes that were not guarded at all now, completely open, and there was something in them that was very bright. She was quiet for a long moment. A meadowlark sang somewhere along the fence line. The spring air moved over the garden with its smell of earth and beginning. "Joel Bristol," she said. "You rode in here in November with store-bought cornmeal and a guilty conscience, and you fixed my fence and my chimney and my barn door, and you stood in my yard and told Carson Meade to respect what I said, and you held my hand through a blizzard, and you bring me flowers without announcing that they are flowers." She paused. "You are the most deliberately decent man I have ever met, and yes, yes, I will marry you." He laughed, a real, full laugh. the kind he had not produced in years, and she laughed with him, kneeling in the spring garden with their hands in the fresh earth. And then he leaned across the bean rows and kissed her for the first time, and it was slow and certain, and it tasted like spring and like something he had been driving toward without knowing it since the day he pointed Cora east from Abilene. They were married in June of 1883 in the church at the end of Harlan Creek's Main Street, the one with the gray-painted walls. The minister was a tall, gentle man named Reverend Hobart who seemed genuinely pleased by the occasion. Margaret Foss stood with Violet and wept in a controlled, dignified way that she would have hotly denied constituted weeping if pressed. Aldrich from the general store came, and his wife, and a handful of other people from town who had formed opinions about Violet Conley over the years and had generally found those opinions to be favorable. The ceremony was simple, the way both of them wanted it. Violet wore a dress of deep blue that she had made herself over the spring months, which Joel had not known about, and the sight of her in it in the church doorway, before the ceremony struck him with a physical force that he would remember clearly for the rest of his life. He wore a clean shirt and his best jacket and had been very careful about his boots. They said their vows with the solemnity of people who had thought carefully about what vows meant, and when the Reverend pronounced them married, Joel took Violet's face in both hands and kissed her the way you kiss someone you intend to spend the rest of your life with, which caused Margaret Foss to produce a handkerchief, and caused Aldrich's wife to elbow Aldrich, who nodded sagely as though he had seen this coming all along. The summer that followed was the best summer Joel Bristol had ever lived. He had begun to think of himself as a man who belonged to a place, which was a new thought for him, and one that fit him the way the homestead fit him, not constrictingly, but fully, with room to move inside it and no desire to move outside. He made the place better. He built a proper bedroom addition onto the south side of the house, with real wood plank walls instead of sod, and a window that faced east so that the morning light came in first thing. He dug a new root cellar, deeper than the old one, which would keep things cooler through the summer and safer from frost in the winter. He built a proper chicken house to replace the lean-to coop that Violet had been managing for years. He also brought his own particular skill with horses to bear on the homestead in a way that proved valuable in ways he had not anticipated. He had been a good horseman all his working life, and he began to train horses from neighboring properties for pay, which added a steady income to what the homestead produced and gave them a financial stability that Violet, managing alone, had never been able to fully achieve. Violet expanded her vegetable garden into a proper kitchen garden and began selling surplus produce to the store in Harlan Creek, an arrangement that Aldrich was genuinely pleased with, and that gave her both income and the satisfaction of having produced something that other people needed. She was, Joel discovered, an excellent businesswoman. She understood numbers clearly and quickly, and negotiated with a pleasant firmness that generally produced the outcome she wanted. Carson Meade appeared once more in July of that first year, and rode to the fence line of the eastern pasture on a morning when Joel was working nearby. He did not come to the house. He sat on his horse at the fence line and looked at the pasture for a while, and then he looked at Joel, and Joel looked back at him, and something was communicated between them without either man speaking. Meade turned his horse and rode away, and that was the last time he came about the land. In the autumn of 1883, Violet told Joel quietly one evening by the fire that she thought she was expecting. She said it with a calm directness that was perfectly in character, but her hands were not quite still in her lap, and he knew that beneath the composure there was something wide open and wondering. He went to her and knelt beside her chair and took her hands and looked up into her face. "How do you feel?" he said. "Frightened," she said honestly, "and glad, mostly glad." "You won't be alone in it," he said. "Not for any of it." She looked at him with those eyes that saw everything, and she nodded, and she trusted him because he had proved himself trustworthy, and that trust, freely given by a woman who had learned to depend on herself, was worth more to him than anything he had ever been given. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, on a night in April when the plains wind was warm for the first time since the fall. Margaret Foss was there because she had experience with births and Violet trusted her, and the doctor from Harlan Creek came out as well and was professionally reassuring throughout. Joel waited in the kitchen with a fire going and the coffee on and his heart in his throat, and at about 3 in the morning Margaret came out and said, "A boy, healthy and loud. You can go in." Joel went in. Violet was propped against the pillow with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and the kind of exhausted radiance that he would never find adequate words for, and she was holding a small, red-faced, deeply indignant person who was evidently offended by the entire enterprise of having been born and was making this known. Joel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and looked at his wife and felt something so large and clear inside him that it had no name. "Hello," he said to the baby. The baby looked at him with the skeptical, unimpressed gaze of the very new and then inexplicably stopped crying. "His name is Thomas," Violet said. She looked at Joel with a questioning gentleness, offering it, not requiring his agreement but wanting it. "Thomas," Joel said. He pressed his lips together for a moment. "Yes, that's right." She reached out and took his hand, and they sat like that in the lamplight with the baby between them, and the wind moved warm over the Texas panhandle. And everything that had led to this moment, Thomas Conley's death, Joel's 6 years of delay, the letter in his breast pocket, the November ride, the long winter, the spring garden, the vows in the gray church. Everything collapsed into the single enormous simplicity of what was in this room, which was a beginning. Thomas Bristol grew into a curious, energetic boy who had his mother's light brown eyes and his father's patient stubbornness, and an absolute conviction that every animal on the homestead was personally interested in his welfare. By the time he was 2, he had named all the chickens. By the time he was 3, he was following Joel to the barn every morning and attempting to assist with tasks that were far beyond his size and entirely within his determination. Joel taught his son the way he did everything else steadily, without impatience, with a respect for the learning process that Violet recognized and appreciated, because it was the same respect she had always been given when she was learning something new. Thomas proved an apt student and a natural horseman, which delighted Joel unreasonably. In 1886, Violet told him she was expecting again. This time she was less frightened and more simply glad, and Joel was glad with her. Their second child was a daughter, born in December of 1886, and she was everything her brother was not: quiet where he was noisy, deliberate where he was impulsive, watchful where he was expansive, and they named her Clara. By the late 1880s, the Bristol homestead on Harlan Creek was one of the most productive small operations in the county. Joel's horse training had developed into a genuine business, with ranches from 3 counties sending horses to him for training, and he had hired 2 young men from town to help with the work, brothers named Peter and Sam Hollies, who were good workers and honest, and quickly became something like members of the extended family of the place. Violet's kitchen garden business had grown into a proper operation that supplied the general store and a hotel that had opened in Harlan Creek in 1885, and she had begun to teach other women in the area methods of preservation and cultivation that extended what could be produced through the winter months. Margaret Foss remained their closest neighbor and dearest friend, and she came for Sunday supper every week without exception, and told Thomas and Clara stories of the early settlement years that were partly true and were always wonderful. Aldrich retired in 1888 and handed the store to his son, who was a decent young man with modern ideas about the importance of customer satisfaction, and who got along well with Joel from the beginning. It was in the spring of 1889, on a warm evening in May, that Joel and Violet walked to the creek after supper, their old ritual, maintained through all the years and through all the changes, The evening walk along the creek bank with the cottonwoods overhead and the water running clear beside them. Thomas was 5 now and had been put to bed, and Clara was 2 and had been asleep since before supper. Margaret had offered to sit with them, as she often did when the parents needed an hour of quiet. They walked with their hands linked, the way they always walked, through the new spring grass along the bank, and stopped at the old cottonwood with the carved initials, TC and VM 1872. Violet had added to it, in the second year of their marriage, JB and VC 1883, in careful letters below the original carving. Joel looked at both sets of letters in the fading light. Violet stood beside him with her head slightly on his shoulder, looking at them too. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "What?" "I think about that November, you riding in. How you looked coming up the road on that roan mare with the saddlebag full of cornmeal." She paused. "You looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was not sure putting it down was allowed." "That's exactly what I felt," he said. "I almost told you to go," she said. "That first evening when you asked to stay a few days, part of me wanted to say no. I had gotten so good at managing alone, and having someone here felt," she searched for the word, "disruptive." "Would you have been right if you'd said no?" She considered it seriously, the way she considered everything. "I would have been safe," she said. "But I would have missed the best thing that ever happened to me." She tilted her head to look up at him. "You are the best thing that happened to me, Joel. Next to that child in there and his sister, who are respectively the best thing and the best thing, but in a different category." He laughed softly. "You are the best thing that happened to me," he said, "by every measurement I know." She turned to face him, and he took her face in both hands the way he had in the church doorway, and he kissed her there under the cottonwood in the May evening with the creek talking softly beside them. And she kissed him back with the fullness of a woman who had learned that love could return to a life that had survived loss and be different from what came before and no less real, no less whole. In September of 1889, Violet discovered she was expecting a third time. She told Joel with a smile that she was no longer frightened at all, only glad, and he told her he was glad too, and he was. Their third child, born in April of 1890, was another boy. They named him William, for no family reason but simply because they both liked the solidity of it, and William proved from the beginning to be the most cheerful person in the household, a baby who regarded the world with a genuine enthusiasm that made everyone who held him smile without meaning to. Thomas, who was 6 when William arrived, appointed himself immediately and with great seriousness as William's primary protector and educator, a role he took on with a self-importance that was mostly endearing and occasionally exhausting. Clara, who was 3, took a slightly more philosophical view of her younger brother's existence, which was also entirely in character. The homestead expanded. Joel built on again, a proper room for the children, with real glass windows, which were a significant investment and which Violet said were the most extravagant thing they had ever done, and which she was entirely in favor of. He built a new, larger barn to accommodate the growing horse operation. He planted an orchard on the eastern slope of the property, apple trees and pear trees, which would take years to mature, but which were an investment in the future of the place, and in the children who would one day inherit it. The Holleys brothers built themselves a small bunkhouse on the property's northwest corner in 1890, which made the arrangement permanent in a way that suited everyone. They were good men, Peter the older, who was 26 and steady and good with horses in the specific patient way that Joel respected, and Sam, who was 23 and quick and funny, and had a habit of reciting poetry he'd learned from some book he'd found in Amarillo, which Thomas and Clara found hilarious, and which even Joel found quietly entertaining. Harlan Creek grew through the late 1880s and early 1890s, the way many Texas panhandle towns grew in that period, slowly, but with a quality of permanence that earlier generations had not been sure to expect. A school opened in 1887, which Violet was vocally in favor of, and which had her fingerprints on it in various ways, including the gift of a set of reading primers that she had written out and had printed in Amarillo, based on what she had learned worked with Thomas in the years before the school existed. Thomas attended school from its opening. Clara attended when she was old enough, with a seriousness about the whole enterprise that made her teachers admire her. William would attend in due course and would distinguish himself mainly by being tremendously well liked by everyone he met, a quality that served him well throughout his life. In the winter of 1891, Joel got a letter from Abilene. It was from a man named Davis Prout, who had worked several cattle drives with Joel in the early 1870s, and who now had a ranch outside Abilene, and was in need of someone to take on the training of about 30 horses he'd acquired from a closing ranch in New Mexico. The pay was more than Joel typically saw in a year of his current operation, and Davis needed the work done in the spring. Joel read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down and looked at it for a while. Then he gave it to Violet. She read it and set it on the table between them. "How long would you be gone?" she said. 3 months, maybe 4 if the horses are particularly difficult." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Thomas and Clara were audible in the yard, arguing about something with the energetic conviction of siblings who are both entirely certain they are right. "The Hollies brothers are here," she said, "and Margaret is close, and I have managed before." She paused. "But I do not want you to go." "I don't want to go," he said. "Then write Davis Prout and tell him you have other commitments. He will find someone." She looked at him across the table with those eyes that saw everything. "We don't need the money badly enough to need you to be somewhere else for 4 months. "No," he said slowly, "we don't." "Then stay." He wrote Davis Prout a polite letter declining the work and recommending 2 men he knew in Abilene who would do it well. And he stayed. And the spring of 1891 was one he remembered always as the one when the orchard trees bloomed for the first time, and the whole east slope was white and pink, and the smell of it reached all the way to the house on a good morning, and Thomas discovered he could climb the apple trees. And William pulled himself up to standing for the first time against the fence post in the yard, while Joel watched, and Violet came out of the house and stood beside him, and they watched together, and she slipped her hand into his the way she always did. By 1895, Thomas Bristol was 11 and had strong opinions about horses, history, and the proper management of the chicken yard, which he had taken over from his mother with a professional seriousness that made Peter Hollies, who was 31 by now and not easily impressed, declare that the boy was going to be a hell of a rancher when he grew up. Clara, who was 9, had developed a passion for reading that rivaled her mother's, and was working her way through every book that Margaret Foss owned, having exhausted what was on the Bristol shelves. William, 5, was happy to follow anyone anywhere, and did so with the cheerful confidence of someone who has never had reason to expect anything but welcome. The homestead that Violet had kept alive alone for 6 years had become something that would have been almost unrecognizable to the woman she was in 1876, newly widowed, standing in a yard with a question in her future, and nothing but her own capability to answer it. And yet the thread was unbroken. The same land, the same creek, the same cottonwoods, the same root cellar that had been dug deeper, the same house that had been built wider, the same woman who had simply grown the life around her the way a tree grows rings, each year adding to what was already there without replacing it. Joel Bristol, who had ridden in on a November day in 1882 with cornmeal and salt pork and a guilty conscience, had become something he had never planned to become and had apparently always been meant to be. He was a man of a place. He was a man of a family. He was, in the simplest and most complete sense, home. In the evenings, still, they sat by the fire. She still read aloud when the children were in bed, and he still worked with his hands at leather or wood or whatever needed doing, and sometimes he still watched her face when he should have been working, and sometimes she still looked up and found him doing it and did not look away. One evening in the autumn of 1895, He found her standing at the kitchen window in the early morning, before the children were up, looking out at the orchard where the apple trees were heavy with their harvest, the red fruit dark in the gray dawn light. She had a coffee mug in both hands and her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and she was wearing the blue wool dressing gown she'd had for years, and she was looking at the orchard with an expression that was both serious and deeply content, the expression of someone who is taking full account of where they are and finding it good. He came to stand beside her, and she leaned slightly into him without looking away from the orchard. 13 years ago, she said, this morning in October, Thomas died. He was quiet for a moment. I know. I think about him on this day every year, she said. I let myself remember him fully, the kind of man he was, the life we tried to build. She paused, and then I look at what was built, and I am grateful for all of it, the before and the after, all of it. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, looking at the orchard in the gray autumn light. He was right about you, she said. He was right about most things. He said you were the most dependable man he knew except in your own interest, she said, and that someday it would catch up with you. And did it? She looked up at him then, and her eyes had that quality of being fully open that he had worked for years to earn and which still struck him, every time, as one of the great privileges of his life. It did, she said. It caught you quite thoroughly. He kissed her forehead. I'm grateful for it. She turned back to the orchard. The apple harvest needs to start tomorrow, she said. Peter says the rain is coming. I'll tell Peter and Sam to start early. And Thomas will want to help. Thomas will insist on it, she smiled, looking at the orchard. He watched her smile in the dawn light, and thought that he had been a man who had ridden across a great many miles of the American West, and had seen a great many things, and none of them had prepared him for how large and simple and complete this kind of happiness could be. The apple harvest came in over 3 days, the whole family involved, Thomas working beside Peter with the focused industry of a boy who liked having a real task, Clara organizing the sorting and packing with the same orderly precision she brought to everything, and William handing apples from the lowest branches to whoever needed them, and eating approximately one for every 3 he handed over, which everyone noticed and no one mentioned. Violet directed the whole operation with the calm efficiency that was her nature, and Joel worked alongside everyone else and watched his family move through the orchard in the clear October light, and felt the thing he had felt by the fire in 1882 when he first looked at Violet's face and started to understand something. That feeling of being in exactly the right place, which had grown in him over the years, not smaller, not familiar in the way that deadens, but larger and more sure and more itself. The boxes of apples went to Aldrich's store and to the hotel and to Margaret Foss and to 3 other households in the area, and what remained went into the root cellar, and Violet spent a week in the kitchen making apple preserves and apple butter that would carry them well into the winter. The smell of warm apple and cinnamon and the sounds of the household around the work were things Joel knew he would carry in him for the rest of his life, the way you carry the things that constitute your understanding of what life is for. They were sitting by the fire on the last evening of October, all 5 of them, a rare occasion when neither child had a reason to be in bed early, and they were all together in the warm room with the fire going and the wind beginning its winter complaints outside. Thomas was reading, stretched out on the floor with the book propped on his arms in a position that made Violet say periodically that he would ruin his eyes. Clara was sewing. She had taken to needlework with a seriousness that still surprised Violet, whose own needle skills were purely functional. William was asleep in the armchair with his boots still on and his mouth open, having apparently decided that whatever the evening held was not going to improve on his current situation. Violet was reading aloud, the way she had always read aloud in this room, and Joel was sitting beside her on the settee they had bought the previous year, his arm behind her on the back cushion, and he was not pretending to work. He was simply listening to her voice in the warm room, and the fire was going, and the wind was outside, and the children were near. And he had ridden in 13 years ago on a cold November day, and he had not left. He had not left because the moment he came here and saw this woman in this yard and sat at this table and listened to this voice, something in him that had been moving for 34 years found what it had been moving toward and stopped. Not in the sense of ending, but in the sense of arriving. He had arrived, and he had stayed, and everything that had built itself up around that staying was the whole of his life and the whole of what he was, and it was more than he had known to hope for. She paused in the reading and looked at him over the top of the book, and raised an eyebrow in the way that meant she had caught him not attending to the text. "I'm listening," he said. "You are not." "I'm listening to you," he said, "which is different." Thomas made a sound that might have been a laugh, disguised as a cough, without looking up from his book. Clara stitched carefully and said nothing, though the corner of her mouth moved. William slept through all of it. Violet looked at Joel for a moment with those light brown eyes that were completely open and entirely his, and then she went back to reading. She did not tell him again to listen. She simply read, and he listened to her read, and the fire burned, and the wind moved over the Texas panhandle in its old, indifferent way, and the homestead stood on the land that Thomas Conley had chosen, and Violet Conley had kept, and Joel Bristol had come to. And it was full of life and light, and the ordinary magnificent substance of a family that had found its way to itself across years and miles and loss and hope, and a letter folded soft from being carried close to someone's heart for a long time. Outside, the cottonwoods along the creek stood in the October dark, and on the trunk of the old big one at the bend, in the dark below, the carved initials of two people who had come here young and full of hope in 1872, and two more people who had found each other here against all the slow resistance of time and guilt and grief. On the dark bark of that old cottonwood, new letters had been carved by a boy of 11 who had taken the matter of family history seriously. TB and CB and WB, 1895. For the three young people who were this land's future, as their parents had been its present, as Thomas and Violet Conley had been its beginning. The creek ran on beside the old tree in the dark. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves. The stars above the Texas panhandle were very bright and very cold and very many, and beneath them the light in the Bristol homestead windows was warm and constant and full of voices, and Joel Bristol, who had ridden in on a November day with cornmeal and salt pork and a promise 6 years overdue, was exactly where he was supposed to be, which is to say he was home.